We're seeing a little bit of that in the guide. The good to finds have been dropping on some titles, which I don't necessarily agree with because it's not necessarily reflecting the market. The thing is that they're not attention getters. The prices in the Overstreet are a lot of it's based on the opinions of advisors, on me being one of them. So we'll put in our opinions and then they decide based on the group of opinions what should change and what shouldn't. So the prices, a lot of people will say, okay, low grade doesn't sell, so they just make a sweep and lower the low grades when it's not necessarily the real market. I would say that probably 90 to 95% of all collectors will never buy a comic over $100. So the idea that only $1,000 and $10,000 and $100,000 comics are worth buying is silliness. Most of the bread and butter comics are the everyday affordable comics. People who actually enjoy comics, want to read comics. There's nothing wrong with that market. I don't agree with the fact that they're dropping the good to find prices on popular titles. Some issues like Conan #1, Iron Man #1, those type of titles, they're impossible to keep in stock and good to find anywhere near guide, and yet the prices are either stagnant or dropping, which makes no sense at all. And there's actually some resistance on the high-end prices in a lot of these books. So,
do you think it's just that the success for Overstreet has been to be conservative and not let things just take off? Because,
well, in a way it's probably good that he didn't let it take off because he might have destroyed his own market, so I kind of agree with being conservative. The problem I have is when he lists things that are in high demand that bring record prices constantly, don't get raised in the guide because it's doing a disservice to both the dealers and collectors who are unaware. There are things that you just can't find, like Pussycat #1 from 1968, the Marvel magazine. Really rare book. Brings multiples of guide all the time, and yet it hardly budges in the guide, you know. Many things that are rare that the price just doesn't go up in the guide. Even if there's multiple sales, they concentrate a lot on the flashy books, I guess you would say. All the major issues, all the high price stuff. So I guess a lot of the stuff gets overlooked. And I guess also if you're an advisor and you have a limited amount of time, you might not have time to mention these things. So there's not enough consensus of opinion that book should go up, so it doesn't.
how do you feel about the huge interest in high-grade silver right now, that probably within a decade all the silver keys will be worth more than all the golden age keys, except for like the top 10?
It seems to be like that because I've noticed the golden age sales have been dropping off a bit, especially middle grade stuff. The affordable low grade seems to still sell. The really high end depends if there's something special, but if it's an ordinary issue, sometimes there's a lot of resistance to selling. But yeah, the market has basically shifted to the silver age and up because that's what everybody's interested in right now, especially with all this movie related comics being hot. So I can't see them surpassing the golden age prices, but they're certainly approaching them, especially when you're seeing prices like $1.1 million for Amazing Fantasy 15.
Right, and that comic now ranks as the 9th most valuable comic, period, in your mint. So.
Which is amazing, but comics are no longer priced by rarity, they're more like supply and demand. So there could be one copy existing, and it might not be that high in value. I've had some very scarce stuff that's barely worth $20 because nobody seems to want it. Giveaways, for example, a lot of giveaways, there's not a lot of copies existing. So Sometimes I get bizarre comics that, what is this? I've never seen this in 40 years. One thing I came across, and I got it listed in the guide not long ago, like how could it escape everybody's notice for all these years? It was a Blondie, I think it was a 100-page giant or something from like 1952. It's never been listed in the guide. I feel, well, how come this is not listed in the guide? So I look it up. Nope, it's not there. So I got it in there, and I got, I believe it was $400 for it. These things just appear every once in a while that seem to have missed everybody's radar, eh?
True. Do you feel, say for Bronze Age for example, you take a key book like Hulk 181, everybody wants it, it's always been popular, always will, but again, yes, 9.8s and stuff, there's only so many,
Yeah.
but generally I'm going to say, for a 70s book, it's a common book.
Yeah.
But more demand than anything. Do you feel that book really will eventually, it'll be a $50,000 9.2 book? Just because demand eventually and age will kick it there?
One of the things that's changing the market is now that basically CGC has bought a restoration company and is allowing pressing, these books are becoming a little more common in high grade, and it's kind of affecting the market. Suddenly, what is there, like 5,000 or some crazy amount of Hulk 181s slabbed. It's not such a rare book. Books that there's like 100 or less copies, those are rare books. Those are the ones that need to see more attention, but people are so one-track mind on their superhero key issues that they don't pay attention to a lot of these titles, eh? Which is kind of sad, because there's a lot of really great books that are, you know, just not paid attention to. I'd like to see people take a chance and try some of these cool other books.
When was sort of the peak years for your retail business?
I think probably actually it was my first 10 years, I think, was just through the roof. I was so busy, I was in there 7 days a week trying to get caught up and pricing things and making phone calls and placing orders, and then I made the even more insane decision. I guess it was around 81 or 2. I figured I'm going to get into comic distribution, so I did that for a couple of years and added that on top of the heap. I think that was when I decided after that was over, it was time to cool it down a little bit, because it was too much to keep up with. What had happened is I got contacted by Hal Schuster from, I guess it was called Irajax at the time, and he kind of took over from Phil Suling, and what he did is he offered me 50% off and as much as 55% off if I would become a wholesaler, which I did. I ended up selling to most of the comic stores in Winnipeg, and I got 50% off and was aimed towards 55% off. But unfortunately he went under after a couple of years, probably for the same reason I got out of distribution. Is unfortunately with a lot of these small comic dealers, it's hard to collect the money. You're ordering comics 2 months ahead of time, and you can't, once you place the order, you can't stop it from coming. If the store folds or can't pay the bills, you get stuck with all these comics. So there was a period in, I think it was about 83 or 4, where I had about 3 or 4 stores fold all at once, and I had $20,000 worth of comics at wholesale on their way to me that I had no use for. What am I going to do with, 500 copies of, Power Man number, 117 or something like that, eh? So that's when I got out of distribution, when I had so much trouble collecting money from other dealers, eh?
And then what did you do after that?
Then did that for a couple of years, and then I went gung-ho into mail order again with more catalogs and more ads in the buyer's guide. Oh, that's right. When I got out of the distribution, that's when I made the decision to start putting back issue prices right in the Marvel Comics. So I did that. I started with a 1/4 page ad, and it was trying to think how much it was. I think it was $3,000 for a little quarter-page ad in Marvel. But in that little ad, I had typed up to 8.5 by 11 page and shrunk it by 60% to 40% of the size. You could barely read it. And in there I had managed to list, by listing, for example, Tarzan 1 to 28. So I managed to list like over 1,000 comics in that ad, and I put clearance 50 cents each. And as far as I could tell, I'm the first person who ever did that. And I did it in Marvel Comics, of course, because that's the place to go. Eh? So I had put this little tiny ad, and within 3 months I'd sold 25,000, no, more like $40,000 worth. The second one was 25. I sold about $40,000 worth of back issues at 50 cents each. Just went crazy trying to keep up with the orders. And everything was very good or better, didn't have to grade it or anything, just out the door. Eh? So that's when I started publishing ads right in Marvel, and then I went up to half-page ads and did that for a few years before everybody else started copying that and kind of killed that market. Eh? So that's basically what I did in the mid-'80s. The other thing I did after, there was a few periods that were bad, that I almost went bankrupt. One of them was that one time when I was going out of distribution and nobody could pay me. Luckily, Irrajacks also went out. They went bankrupt, I didn't, because I resorted to these ads and to other things and managed to get out of it. The other thing I did was making wholesale packages, store starter kits, eh? So I think I was maybe one of the first people who ever did that too. So I would sell, for example, 20,000 back issues all bagged in price for you. All you had to do is put them out in the bin. You had an instant back issue comic store. And then I would connect them with the wholesalers for the new comics, and they could get the new comics in, and I would show them how to do the subscription sheets, and they would set up their store. And in a period of about 4 years, I sold about 6 of those packages for about $20,000 each. Eh? Some of them were a little smaller because they didn't have as much money, like 10, but I cleared out a lot of overstock comics and got a lot of stores started in that time period. Eh?
So after that time period, who were you getting your comics through after you stopped distributing yourself?
For a while there, then I switched to getting comics through Joe Krolick when he was a wholesaler, and then after that it was through Hero, who had taken over for a short period of time, and then Geppy eventually took over the market, I guess. Eh? So yeah, there was kind of comic wholesaler wars for quite a few years there, and Geppy appeared as the leader, who basically took over the market for quite a while. And I don't even know what the situation is today. What is the situation?
Yeah, he's the number one and
yeah,
the only
he's
one.
the only one, pretty much. Eh? I remember there wasn't there some kind of court battle or something about monopoly or something at one point in time. And I seem to recall the ruling was something along the lines of comics are basically the same thing as coloring books and all the rest, so, and children's books. So because of that, it's not really a monopoly, because there's coloring books and other stuff out there. There was some irrational thing like that, so he got to keep the market from what I could. This is the way I understood it. I might not have got it right, but.
So by the 90s, you decide to stop selling new comics. Now
I was still selling comics till '96. I was still selling quite heavily. Actually, through the '80s, because of that one scare I had there with going out under the by the wholesaling there, I figured I'm going to get some sidelines going here, so I had some other business to go to in case the main thing goes. If the comics are unpopular, I want to have something else to sell. So I started with records. So I started my first record store, which I called Rock Revival back then. I think that was around 1982 or so, somewhere around there. I had that for about 6 or 7 years on its own, and in the late 80s I combined it with my comic store. And then I got into posters and role-playing games and let's see what else. Then I got into paperbacks and hardcovers and all kinds of stuff. I dipped in the waters there. Eh? So all those sidelines helped things. In the late 80s, I got into VHS videotapes, which was big for about 10 years. Initially, I would get either from stores that were going under or stores that would have too many copies of something, and they would give me a wholesale price to take the lot and take them off to the flea markets or my own stores, and did really well with that for a long time. In the late 80s, I also got into sports cards, which was huge for basically from about 88 to about 94, I guess, was the big years. Unfortunately, the print runs are so huge in those years, they're basically the most worthless years in sports card history, and I don't know if that'll ever change. There's just a huge glut in the market of that stuff, and it's being sold by the pound nowadays, I guess. So, and I guess a lot of people put a lot of money into that. Probably lost a lot of money on that. And then I got into the non-sports cards, and of course the magic cards. And tried just about everything at one point or time. And my warehouse is still full of a lot of this stuff, so still sitting on about 100,000 records, which we're finally starting to list after all these years and get a list online. These records are starting to sell again. Back issue magazines are another biggie for me. Not many people do it online, and you'd be surprised. If you're looking for a back issue, Time or, Life, a lot of these things you can find on eBay, but a lot of them you can't. For example, if you're looking for Muscle and Fitness from, November of '82, might not be that hard, might not be that easy to find one, even on the internet, because there's not a lot of back issue magazine dealers out there. So I'm sitting on about 250,000 back magazines and about 250,000 paperbacks.
Yeah.
So, paperback market's completely different from the comic market. It's more based on pure supply and demand. So the price guides that came out in the 70s and 80s were great for a long time. The internet age has changed that. So now a book that's 20 years old could suddenly be more valuable than one that's 70 years old very easily, just because a lot of people want it. Like, who would think that the Labyrinth paperback from the mid 80s is a $75 book? Most people wouldn't think that. I mean, the market changes, it goes up and down, but at this point in time it's still around a $75 book. Meanwhile, some of the books that used to list for paperbacks that used to list for $100 in the early price guides in the 80s are going for $6. So it's a pure supply and demand market. If that ever applied to comics, the entire face of comics would change. If the price guide suddenly wasn't used like it is now, right now it's still used as a Bible. But if it was based on pure supply and demand, you would find stuff like some of the Richie Rich digests that went into numbers 40s to be some of the most possible things to collect. Some of those books would be $50 books instead of $2 books, Right. And Spectacular Spider-Man #1, which is a $100 book, might go down to $1 because it's so common. So,
do you see that it could shift that way in the future, or do you think it will actually stay more the way it is and get even worse?
I think it's going to pretty much stay the way it is, because there's so much worldwide demand for the superhero and the comics in general. The thing that's different between the book market and the comic market is the comic market has really swung towards condition being important, whereas the book market is basically, I want a reading copy. So, for example, Man from U.N.C.L. #23, the paperback. A reading copy, let's say in fair to good, might go for $50, and a near mint copy might go for $75. So it's quite a big difference between the comic and book market.
So it's really, in a sense, how the comic used to be 45 years ago.
Yeah.
Where it's like...
Yeah, it was like the wild frontier when I started back in the late 60s and early 70s, I mean, if it was impossible to find, you can get more money for it. So, and that, it's probably going to affect some comics in the future more than it is. And if you check eBay prices, it's strange how many comic just has to be a little bit hard to get to be double and triple guide. Like right now, just as a crazy example, it's hard to get the first appearance of Professor Zoom, which is Flash 139, so that's a double guide book. Eh? You wouldn't know it because, unless you're, I guess, a Flash fan and even know who Professor Zoom is, who is the reverse Flash. Eh? Some people think maybe he'll be in a movie one day, so all of a sudden everybody wants that. Was it Adventure 288, for example? I think it's 288. The first Phantom Zone, which is also the first General Zod. Suddenly that's a hot book. There's not a lot of copies around any grade, so overgraded copies are going for about double guide in actual condition on eBay. Eh? So that's a little bit more of a pure supply and demand.
So what happened in the late 90s when all of a sudden the obscure Bronze Age books become hot? Who started this trend?
Actually, it was the late 90s where the obscure stuff took off. First of all, let's... Okay, why don't we talk about that for a second? I had a few different catalogs that advertised in different places, and things like Weird War #1, for example, it's just as one of the main titles that was striking a chord. I had all these people asking for, because I had all the weird titles, stuff like that. Weird War #1 to 10, for example, which was like $5 in the guide at the time, and Weird Western, and nobody else was selling it. I was getting endless demand for these things, so I started raising my prices, and I would buy them for full retail and then double them, and then I couldn't find them, so I'd pay a guide and a half and put triple. But it doesn't sound like much money now, but getting $15 for a Weird War 1 in VG when it was $5 in near mint was pretty good back in those days. Eh? Yeah. That's how it started for me. And then they would ask for a lot of these obscure, like Swing with Scooter and those type of titles. And then 100 Pagers became hot, and all this obscure stuff was kind of starting to sell out once. And that was in the late 90s, I guess, what, 96, 78, around there. All that stuff was going crazy, and of course, I'm the only one who had a lot of these things, so everybody was coming to me for these things. So that's kind of how that started for me. And what happened is I had always sent a little bit of information to Overstreet every year, but that was the year that I decided I'm going to send them this massive report. So I sent them in, I don't know how many thousands of price changes, and this big long letter explaining why all these things should be changed. And the guy came out, and I was shocked to see that he had done like almost every change I had mentioned. And all of a sudden Weird War #1 had tripled in price, and all these prices, and everybody went crazy over all these hard to get books, which I'd always known had been hard to get, but nobody had ever paid attention to these things. Eh? So that was the big craze of the late 1990s, is all these oddball books, and that lasted for almost a decade. I think the thing that stopped them is they actually reached too high a price in too short a period of time, and they kind of turned people off. And at the same time, that's when CGC was coming in, and that kind of turned people off too. But I still believe in books that are rare in any grade are good items. You know, try to put together a decent set of Swing the Scooter or any of these type of titles, eh? Right. A lot of people have never even heard of these titles, eh?
Right, you may recall that's how we met in the first place, because that's what I
what...
decided I'd be one of the kingpins of hunting these rare books out. Yeah. And that's all I wanted. And so from that day on, I sort of became anti-superhero.
Yeah.
Because I appreciate the books that have been published by these companies that have been forgotten or ignored or whatever, right?
Yeah, well, I remember us talking about 100 Pagers, eh? I think you were trying to get the 100-page set, right?
Yeah, well, I pretty well had every
Except the
obscure
loved
DC.
ones.
Well, I had all the loved ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, I ended up having all those too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean,
But
I was,
the loved ones were a big obstacle, especially in
yeah,
decent condition, eh?
yeah.
You know, like, I don't know, how many was there, about 25 of the 100 pages, or 20 or something? I can't remember exactly, but suddenly we're going from like $5 to 50 to $150. They were big crazy prices for a little bit of time. And they actually went up a little bit too fast in the guide, and they came back down a little bit, eh? I think they went from like, what, 5 to like $152 in like 2 years. And then they came back down, but now they're back up again, eh?
So when we have a sort of a fad like that,
Mm.
is this when we're glad Overstreet is accurate, or we're actually happy when Overstreet does seem to be behind the time?
Yeah. Well, the thing is that I guess there has to be enough people reporting that these things are happening for something to actually get changed in the guide. And I guess I wasn't the only person experiencing this demand for all these oddball titles.
Right.
So I think he took me pretty much literally that these titles were all hot, and then he actually pretty much verbatim raised all the prices that I suggested that year, and that's when I started with my big market reports again. I'd done small ones, but I started with the big ones again, and I've done it ever since the late 1990s. And I've changed a lot of things in the guides in the last 15 years.
Do you see a similar type of copper craze for rarity books ever happening in the same way?
Coffer's already taken off for about 5 years for me, because I sell a lot of 9.0 to 9.8 copies, where other people don't, because basically the majority of dealers can't grade properly 9.0 to 9.8 comics. So people have to rely on CGC copies if they really want those grades. I had the good fortune of getting George Bedelli's collection, where I had a lot of high grade copies of these things, and people really appreciated being able to buy, say, a 9.6 $5 book for $15 without having to buy a slab copy for $30 to $50. So I literally sold like 10,000 high grade copies at 2, 3, and 4 times guide for books mostly from 1975 to 85, and now it's extending into the mid-90s. These books are not nearly as common as everybody seems to think they are in high grade. They've been abused all these years. Even like Atlas Seaboard always have been fairly common comics, but they're not common in 9.0 or better. Well, we discovered that 10 years ago already. Now what we're discovering is stuff like, well, we already know, because I got it into the guide. I got the high numbered Transformers raised in price. What I had found is the same trend I'd found in mass market paperbacks. When the title is dying, the print runs plummet, and that makes them scarcer. So I had been selling paperbacks since the 70s, so I'd always known this trend. So, Man from U.N.C.L.E. paperbacks from 21 to 23 are worth more than 1 to 20 put together.
Yeah.
Because they're scarce. See? So it's happening in all these titles that got cancelled. So the high numbered Ghost Riders are scarcer, the high numbered Star Wars are scarcer, the high numbered Savage Swords are scarcer, the high numbered Transformers, the high numbered everythings are scarce. The reason they got cancelled is because the sales were dropping. So the number ones that everybody bought millions of copies of, or not millions, but you know what I mean. They stocked up, say, 100 copies or 50 copies as an investment. Those are the common ones. Nobody needs Dazzler number 1. They need Dazzler number 50.
Yeah.
Nobody needs Transformers. Well, they're starting to buy Transformers 1. I shouldn't say that. But Transformers 1, let's face it, is still a common comic. It's just rare in 9.4 or better. But Transformers 70 went to 80. Low print runs, nobody has them. Unless they have them, priced in the stratosphere. They're pretty much everybody's sold out. High numbered G.I. Joes. That's the trend on this newer stuff. And then things that people overlooked that later became popular. And there's quite a few of them,
Do you believe that in the future there could be a bigger price spread, even from, say, an 8 to a 9 for modern books? Because everyone wants the top, and yeah, there's lots of 8s, but
Yeah. Well, as long as there's people who want to read the books, you'll be able to always move the lower grade ones because they're not that expensive. So you'll still be able to sell your American flag runs for $1 a piece across the board, people who want to read them. But people who want to have investment copies, try to put together a set of, American flag in 9.4 or better. It's not that easy. These comics have been abused and treated like junk for the last 20 years, and there's not a lot of 9.4 copies of even something as common as American flag or Grimjack or any of those type of titles. Never mind the key issues. So that's why stuff like X Factor 4 and 5 are bringing good prices now, because there actually are scarce and high grade.
so looking back at your entire career in comic books, has there been personal favorite times for you? Things that you've really been excited to have been a part of?
Wow, there's so many. I have to think about where I would narrow it down to. One of the most exciting periods when I was going to the early comic conventions in the 70s. I recall going to Minneapolis, for example, and with like 100 want lists, pages and pages of want lists from comic collectors wanting me to look for things. And in Minneapolis, comics were easier to get, back issues were easier to get than in Canada. So I would go there. I would try to trade or buy or whatever. I'd have a table, sell some stuff, get some cash together, and I'd come back with like 20 or 30 or 40 boxes of back issues. I would publish ads in the buyer's guide, and the stuff would come pouring in the doors, and customers would be lined up out the door to buy these things, because it just wasn't easy to find these issues then. It was an exciting period. And the whole thing about getting in fanzines and portfolios and doing all these things that nobody had ever done, that was a very exciting period for me. I guess late 70s to early 80s was probably one of my favorite time periods in comics. And people were still in love with the comics themselves and not so much worried about investing. I like that too. Nowadays there's a lot more writing on what's investment quality and this type of thing.
How do you recommend somebody who just wants to start collecting, but they have an interest in books that they just can't possibly afford?
Yeah. Well, you could actually, I would say that there is still a very big market for reading copies, and if you just want to dabble in reading copies, you'll always be able to resell them. If you're buying them at the low end, you'll always be able to resell them at the low end. So that would be one of my recommendations. A lot of people, if they want stuff to be able to turn over, you're going to have to stick to key issues, because that's pretty much the market right now. Or else collect things that are just interesting. And one of my favorite things has always been to gather up stuff that's hard to find in any condition and other people have never seen and don't even know what it is. I have a lot of people who just love that stuff, and there's always a market for it, because you only need one customer to need a rare book. So to me, that's still the most exciting thing, is finding things even after all these years that I've never seen, and I still do find those things.
Does it ever amaze you just to think the money that is in these comics that you used to have 40 years ago that were $1?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I had discovered, I had bought a collection in the early 80s, I think it was 81 or 2, and it was Golden Age comics, and the fellow's name, I believe he had passed away, but I'm not sure about that. But I had bought his collection. It was about 100 Golden Age comics, and most of them were in the very fine to near mint range, and the Detective 27 and Superman 1, and the Superman number 1 by 1982 Sanders was at near mint. Today it'd probably be more like a very fine. And the Detective 27 had masking tape on the spine and a split spine. that was the early years when restoration was getting started. So I sent it off to get restored, and they got the tape off the spine, they patched the spine up, put it back together, and it looked like a very fine. So I sold the Spider-Man 1 for $5,000, or Superman number 1 for $5,000, and I believe it was $4,000 I got for the restored Detective 27. So yeah, I think that Superman number 1 might be the copy that sold for about $250,000 a few years back. So things have changed a little bit since those days, eh? I also recall selling off my personal collection, I believe it was 1988, because that's, I had so many books in my warehouse, I figured, what do I need 40,000 comics of my own for? I got 1.5 million comics sitting in my warehouse. Basically, a lot of them are the same books. Condition might be different. If I want to read a comic, I could just pick it up and read it. So I come to the conclusion that I'm not going to keep a personal collection anymore. Of course, that was a big mistake. How many mistakes do we make? Well, we'll make a few over the years. One of the books I had sold was my Amazing Fantasy 15. I got $1,500 for it back in '88, and the guy who I sold it for contacted me, I think it was 2001 or 2 or so, and he had it graded by CGC and it was a 9.4. So today it'd be worth $250,000 plus, eh? So that was not the best $1,500 sale I'd ever made. So, but who knew?
Yeah.
We had to kind of think that we thought Marvels were peaking at the $2,000 range back in that time period, eh?
Right. So if somebody did actually come to you now and says, I do want to buy a key book,
Mm-hmm.
what do you tell them at this point? When you know, now it's $100
Well,
grand for these books.
Yeah. My advice is either you buy the best of the best if you have a lot of money. If you don't have a lot of money, what you should be buying is affordable stuff that will always interest people. So key issues doesn't have to be high grade. It can be good to find, or it can be a slab near mint, you know, but a key issue will always sell, or a very popular title or very popular run will always sell. That would be one good thing to buy. The mistake that a lot of people make is buying it at the peak. The thing has just gone up 2 or 3 or 4 or 500% overnight. This is not the time to buy. This is the time to sell. That's the biggest mistake most people make. I tell it to people all the time. They don't listen to me because they think they're going to make even more. I had 50 copies of Marvel Preview Magazine number 7, the Satana issue that happened to have the first Rocket Raccoon. I was getting $50 and $75 and $100 each for like VG and fine copies of this book that's basically a $5 book. Everybody's betting the farm that Guardians of the Galaxy movie is going to be the biggest hit of the century or something. What if it isn't? There's a good chance it might not go anywhere. So what is that $75 copy of VG Marvel Preview number 7 going to be worth after the movie comes out and it doesn't become a success? The chances of you know, making money paying $75 for a book like that had a guide value at the time of like $5, not so good. You're better off to buy key issues that people haven't paid attention to yet that are still cheap. Like I'm looking at books that are crazy in the guide, like, you know, in the mid 80s, when the copper or the Bronze Age was ending and the Copper Age was coming to, you know, Spider-Man got the black costume, all that type of thing. A lot of those books are still quite cheap, and actually a pretty good investment, especially at the current prices. Like I'm looking at Justice League number 1, the '87 one. That's a cheap book. Flash number 1, cheap book. Legends number 6, the first New Justice League, stuff like that. You know, buy a few of those in high grade. Sit on those for a few years. How wrong could you possibly go? I mean, so you paid $5 for it and it doesn't take off. Well, sell it for $5. Somebody else will buy it. chances are, given another 5 or 10 years, those could be $50 or $100 books, especially if you slab them. In fact, if you got a 9.8 on some of those right now, you could probably get $100 for them. You know, I'm thinking of sending in my Mage #6, you know, first color Grendel story, this type of thing, eh? A lot of the scarcest books of the 80s are the alternatives. There's a lot of good alternatives. Just as an example, how many people know that your average 9.8 Dave Stevens cover book from the 80s will bring $100? Most people don't know that because they haven't looked, eh? Well, Dave Stevens covers are a big deal to a lot of collectors right now. There's a lot of completionists out there. So right now I bought up his first fanzine cover, I think it was 1974, on this unpronounceable cover. I'd have to look up the name. But I figure, as far as I can tell, that was his first published cover. It's kind of this gargoyle type creature on the cover. So I bought up a couple of copies of those. I'm going to sit on those for a while. I have a high grade one I'll probably be sending off to CGC, sitting on it for a little while. Eh? I mean, buy up things that have major potential while they're still cheap. That would be my advice, but you have to have a little bit of knowledge, I guess. Eh?
Did you ever order Ninja Turtles #1?
I did, but I didn't get the first printings. I got second printings. I guess they sold out so fast, I was not able to get a first printing.
And do you remember, was there an instant buzz over that?
Instantly. People were calling long distance from my ads in the Buyer's Guide and my comic ads and all the locals, and everybody was calling off the wall for that book when it came out. I think it was pretty much $50 overnight almost, that book. That's kind of one of the things that made the independent craze in the mid-80s take off. People, stuff like Boris the Bear #1 and all those type of titles, eh? Boris the Bear #1, it was a $50 title in the mid-80s, but who remembers that now, eh?
So what do you feel would be sort of that book over the years that you missed the boat? Like that would be one example. Is there any others that you go, oh?
Well, one of the things I missed the boat on is selling off my 1960s fanzines too cheap. I had a few really good collections over the years. I had one again about a year ago. That one went for a better price, but one major collector bought the whole lot, so I probably could have made more on them, but I'd like to see them get a nice home to a collector. But a lot of these 60s ditto zines and fanzines had very tiny print runs. I think even Comic Reader and the Collector and those, they had some of the early issues had print runs of like 25 copies and 50 and 100 copies. Like, we're talking ridiculously small print runs. One of the first Marvel fanzines ever published was called the Yancey Street Journal and the Yancey Street Gazette. They had print runs of like 50 and 100 copies, and they were just thin little cheesy fanzines, but they were from like 1964 and stuff, eh? I mean, that's rare. So there was a fanzine price guide that came out by Robert Dale, I believe his name was. I talked to him on the phone quite a few times because he was trying to get information to get this guide out, eh? But he's hardly touched the surface to what's out there. I think fanzines is one of the most overlooked areas in all of comics. The 60s ditto zines, the sky is the limit the prices those could go to. And then you get into the 70s fanzines, like all the stuff like, you know, Bad Time Stories by Wrighton. That stuff is it's inexpensive compared to some of those Bronze Age comics from that period, eh? So
speaking of that, are there any actual comics generally that you go, even though of course you want to make a living with comics, but are there certain comics that you go, gosh, it's way overpriced for what it is, how common it is, whatever.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think some of the Marvel keys are kind of high because I get even though people ask for them, there's resistance to not quite high enough grade copies of stuff like let's say 9.0 copies of stuff like X-Men 94 and Giant Size X-Men 1 and stuff like that. There's resistance to that. They sell great and good to find because people want affordable copies. In fact, they go way over guide, but then they get a little tough to sell in kind of the mid-high range. Then if you got a 9.8, then again they want them, but some of those books might be a little high. I would have said Star Wars is overpriced until Disney bought Star Wars, but now Star Wars is taking off again. So you never know. Like one of my better stories was the Michael Jackson. I had when I was sorting out my records in my warehouse. I had 150 copies of Michael Jackson Thriller LP. And then he passed away, and of course everybody's trying to get everything online immediately. I think it was you that told me. Wasn't it you? You told me list it immediately. That's right, it was. That's right. I listed them online. I sold all 150 copies in one weekend for between $30 and $75 a piece. It was ridiculous. I was actually considering to make space to throwing out half those copies because I had so many. And there's other things like Foreigner 4. I've got like 100 copies of some of these records. I have way too many copies of. What am I going to do with them? I'd actually at one point in time even considered throwing them out. So
Yeah. That's definitely a trend that's growing online. Is actually it's like somebody passed away. It's like I got a market all of a sudden. It wasn't there yesterday, and it's kind of sad.
It is
but
sad.
I know, but it's there.
It's there.
People
like,
care all of a sudden.
Yeah, like what are you going to do, eh? I even went to my pawn shop for my worst copies that were unplayable that I'm not going to sell and get a negative on eBay. I said, will you give anything in trade for this? He gave me $200 trade for a bunch of beat up Michael Jackson Thriller albums, and I just took some DVDs home to watch, so I got $200 worth of DVDs for a bunch of basically beat to hell Thriller albums, eh? But I got rid of them at the right time. My philosophy is to sell stuff when they want it, and not try to sell what I want to get rid of when I want to get rid of it.
Right.
And
I would think that is your key to success.
Yeah.
Because it is going through the trends. And again, I think that's worked for you because you have so much to pull from. You can go.
Yeah.
And again, I think you have that advantage over so many people.
Yeah.
In fact, I come from Saskatoon, 250,000 people. Nobody sells back issues in the entire city.
Well, really?
Nobody. 4 comic stores. Nobody wants.
Well, that would
to deal
explain
with
why
it.
I get so many mail orders from there. Then, I mean, I would say half of my customers in Canada are from Saskatchewan and Alberta, and the rest of Canada makes the other half. So I don't know what it is about Alberta and Saskatchewan, but there is a heavy collector's base in both. In fact, that's one of the irritating things is I try to buy stuff off eBay often, and how many American dealers won't sell to a Canadian? Do they realize what they're doing to themselves? Like I would say since the 2008 recession started there, I would say the number of Canadian collectors has doubled for me. Canada being 1/10 the population of the United States, my sales have usually been about 10% Canadian, 10% foreign, and 80% American, eh? Mm-hmm. I would say the change that has happened since 2008 is it's about 20% Canadian and about 15% foreign and about 65% American. So Americans who refuse to sell out of their own country are fools, and there's a lot of them. It's not that hard to put a custom sticker on it and charge exact postage, but a lot of people won't do it, so they're cheating themselves. Especially if it's an auction, these people are going to bid those books up, especially some of the stuff that might not be so saleable in the States, like a low grade, like say a GVG copy of a Dell or something like that. The biggest audience for low grade Dells actually is overseas. So you're making a big mistake by not selling to Canada and overseas, but you can't talk to these people. Some of them actually get mad if you ask them, will you ship to Canada?
Yeah. Tell me about 1996.
Mm-hmm.
Why the change in your...
96, yeah. That's when I had been retailing for 22 years, and basically I was the stress level had pretty much hit the ceiling for me, because I had moved, I think, 7 times over the years. I've had maybe 150 employees over the years. I'd done mail order, I'd done stores. I had a store in Calgary. I'd done the wholesale. I'd done the whole thing for all these years. And the stress was pretty much getting to me after all those years. I was worried I was going to end up having a heart attack or something like that. And of course, the mail order market was getting better and better, and the Winnipeg market was dropping off. The exchange was getting higher, and they didn't want to pay the American prices, and so it kind of all came together at the same time. Marvel sales were going down, DC sales were going down. Marvel almost went bankrupt after I just moved to Steinbach. So it was kind of an implosion time for new comics, and of course I got stuck with a whole bunch of new comics and lost a lot of money at one period in time there. After the Valiant crash, I had made a lot of money during the Valiant boom. Then I got stuck with 50 and 100 and 200 copies each of a lot of these books, just like everybody else. And all the early images, I got stuck with tons of that stuff. And I basically got tired of the new comic game, because how many times I have had subscribers to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, and they all cancel at once, and you get stuck with all these books, and they keep coming for months. It keeps happening. So at one point in time, it just got very stressful. Add to that the fact that I had people breaking into my warehouse and breaking into my store and breaking into my house and breaking into my car, and I had customer theft, and I had employee theft, and I had accountants stealing from me, and I had carpenters stealing from me, and everybody was stealing from me. So it was a frustrating time period, and I said, okay, enough. I'm making all my money on mail order. Why am I doing retail? So that's pretty much where the decision came from. And I figured, you know what, it's time to do all retail. In '96, I was 40 years old, and I was sitting on about 1.3 million comics, and 250,000 records, and 250,000 paperbacks, 100,000 records, 20,000 posters, and on and on and on. I had been so busy in all those years that half of it was unsorted. In fact, it was in a 6,000 square foot warehouse when I needed a 10,000 square foot one, but it was just rammed in there to the point where my paperbacks were just in a mountain. I couldn't sort them, I had no room. So it all kind of led to the same thing. I had to move, and the store was getting to be too much. So I figured it's time to go all mail order, 'cause what am I going to do with all this stuff? I have to get it cataloged, I have to actually start selling it, or I'm going to die with it, eh? So that's basically where that came from. So I moved out to Steinbach. Spent the last 17 years cataloging, we're still not done. It's basically almost all sorted. The fellow who achieved that is my warehouse manager, David Reed. He's done a fabulous job. He's worked for me since about 81 or 2, I believe. There was about a 5-year stint when he wasn't around. But he's got it all organized. And I don't have to depend on others. I got me, him, and my wife. I personally look at the stuff. I don't like bad grading, so I like to grade things myself, and people like that. I have my stuff mostly listed online, and people like that. They want me to have a fancy website with everything priced and graded, but that's not going to happen, because I have 3 million items to grade and price. I haven't got that many lifetimes to do that. Do I want to hire more staff? No. So I'm pretty much happy where I am right now, and basically I concentrate on selling stuff to people when they want it, and that seems to be a pretty successful formula.
How do you balance deciding when, even though you've got 3 million items, you still go on eBay and you buy more stuff?
A lot of it has to do with demand, because when people want it, I want to get it for them, and they like that. Actually, I still have a fair number of customers who are not in line, believe it or not. A lot of them will phone me up or write me or whatever, and I will find the stuff for them, even if I have to pay full guide and sell it for guide and a quarter, guide and a half, depending on the value. So that's
Now,
mainly
have
what
you
I
found selling online as opposed to just the old-fashioned mail
Well, you
order
know what?
way?
It was great to. I mean, I had a lot of customers that were friends over the years. There was many things good about the store, but the crowds and the pressure and everything, it was enough to do just about anyone in after a long period of time. I don't know how. I would say that's one of the reasons that a lot of the stores don't last that long, because there's a lot of pressure, especially new comics. Those constant deadlines of big shipments coming in, and you have to get it all organized and put them all on hold for all the customers, and then are the customers actually going to pick it up, or are they going to put it back? And ordering all these things, and the phone ringing, and mail orders coming in, and it gets to be a lot after a long period of time. So the chance of me starting up a retail store again are pretty slim. But if I was younger, I would do this for another 100 years if I could. Probably won't last that long, I don't think, but
So what's the future?
the future is I'm going to be breaking a lot of these things up into small affordable lots, which I've been doing for a couple of years now, and making a lot of sets, like full Spider-Woman sets and whatever, and just clearing a lot of this inventory out. And basically I kind of want to be left with the best of the best, and if I can get rid of a lot of the quantity I have, then I could have a more finite amount of stuff to carry around with higher value. Maybe get down to that, and maybe eventually if I'm not around anymore, that stuff can maybe go to an auction house or something. So, but my goal at the current point in time is to get down the quantity, because my warehouse is 2 floors, 4,000 square feet each, which is 8,000 square feet, and I need more like 12, so it's way overcrowded. Trying to get the quantity down, eh?
What is the biggest comic sale you've ever made?
A single item, or
Yeah.
just one order?
Both, either.
Yeah, it's kind of. Well, I remember I made a couple of. Well, not counting the wholesale store lots, which is about $20,000 ranges. I've made a couple. I think one order was about $30,000, and that was basically a bunch of runs of very finer, better Silver Age Marvels, and that was from one of my best customers. His name is Fred Zabel. I haven't seen him for a few years, so I hope he's still okay. He was a Winnipegger, and he moved out to Western Canada, or sorry, I mean to Eastern Canada. But he had a huge collection. I don't know, maybe 50 or 60,000 comics, and he had made a decision, kind of like I did at one point in time, is that he wanted to get runs of everything, and he was more interested in mid-grade runs than a handful of overpriced high-grade comics. So he ended up having 40 or 50,000 comics instead of, say, 1 or 2,000 high-grade comics, because he just loved comics, eh?
So here's a question for you. You might have to think a little hard. Somebody said, what is the single rarest comic in the last 40 years?
The rarest comic in the last 40 years? Probably Universe Man #1. It's a really bad comic that I drew and made myself and published as a kid in 1966, and there's no known copies.